Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we descend into the forgotten hollows of Appalachia, a place where mountains stand like ancient sentinels, where fog clings to valley floors like something alive, and where every small town guards secrets older than the roads that lead to them. These are not the mountains you see in postcards. These are the places where cell signals die, where families have lived for generations without ever speaking certain names aloud, where the woods grow so thick that sunlight never touches the ground. The stories you're about to hear come from people who lived through something they can't explain, from mining towns that appear on no modern map, from hollows so deep the sun sets 2 hours early, from churches where services haven't been held in decades, but the lights still turn on. These accounts were shared in whispers, typed in the dead of night, confessed years after the events because silence became unbearable. This is Appalachia, stripped of myth and tourism. This is the place locals know, the place they warn their children about, the place where something watches from tree lines and listens from abandoned houses. If you're drawn to the kind of truth that lingers in the dark, make sure to subscribe and stay with us tonight. The camera was still recording when we found it. That's what I keep coming back to. 3 days of battery life left, memory card half full, the lens covered in condensation but otherwise undamaged. It was sitting on a flat rock beside Cutter's Creek, pointed directly at the tree line, as if someone had carefully positioned it there before walking into the woods and never coming back. The timestamp showed it had been recording for 16 hours straight. 16 hours of absolutely nothing. Just wind moving through branches, water flowing over stones, and one other sound that shouldn't have been there at all. I'm Marcus Webb, 34 years old, and at the time I was working as a county surveyor based out of Harlan. Though my routes took me deep into the unincorporated areas where Kentucky bleeds into Virginia, and the mountains get so steep you navigate by creek beds instead of roads. I'd always prided myself on knowing these mountains. My grandfather had worked coal in Lynch. My father had been a timber scout, and I'd spent my whole life believing that Appalachia was harsh but knowable, that every legend had a logical root. Cutter's Hollow proved me wrong. The place isn't on most maps. It's a slash of valley between two ridges about 40 miles south of Pikeville, accessible only by a logging road that hasn't been maintained since the 90s. Population had never been more than 30, mostly one extended family, the Cutters themselves, who'd lived there since before the Civil War. By 2018, only 7 people remained, all elderly, all related, living in houses their great-grandparents built. I'd been hired by the state to survey the area for a potential land trust, something about protecting old-growth forest. Simple job: document boundaries, check for structures, note any environmental concerns. I'd done 50 assignments just like it. I drove in on a Tuesday morning in late September, the air crisp with coming autumn, leaves just starting to turn. The logging road was rougher than I'd expected, my truck bottoming out twice before I reached the hollow proper. When I finally emerged from the tree tunnel, I found myself in a valley that felt like it existed in a different century. 4 houses, all hand-hewn log construction, weathered gray, a collapsed barn, a small cemetery on the hillside, tilted stones marking graves dating back to the 1840s. No power lines. No satellite dishes. The only modern element was a satellite phone installation on one porch. Emergency communication mandated by the county, but no people. I parked near what looked like the main house and called out. Nothing. The silence in the hollow was profound. Not peaceful, but heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. Even the birds were quiet. I spent the first hour walking the perimeter, taking photographs, making notes. That's when I found the first camera. It was strapped to a tree at the edge of the clearing, one of those motion-activated trail cameras hunters use. Then I found another, and another. By the time I'd completed my circuit, I'd counted 11 cameras, all positioned to face the forest, creating an overlapping field of view that covered every approach to the houses. Someone had been watching the tree line, obsessively. I returned to the main house and knocked harder, announcing myself. The door was unlocked. Inside, I found a home that looked lived in but evacuated, dishes in the sink, a Bible open on the kitchen table, a radio with batteries still good. The calendar on the wall showed September 2018, the current month, with the 18th circled in red ink. That was 4 days ago. On the kitchen counter, I found a handwritten note. If you're reading this, we've gone to Pritchard's Ridge. Don't follow, don't stay after dark, don't go into the woods alone. E.C. Beside the note was a digital video camera, the expensive kind, with an external battery pack and weatherproof housing. This was the camera I'd later find by the creek. But at that moment, it was sitting there like someone had just set it down. My surveying work required me to map the property boundaries, which meant hiking the ridgelines. I wasn't about to let a cryptic note derail a state contract, but I also wasn't stupid. I took the camera with me, figuring I could review whatever footage might explain the situation. The forest around Cutter's Hollow was old. Real old growth, never logged, with trees thick enough that 3 men couldn't link hands around them. The canopy blocked most of the sunlight, creating a permanent twilight at ground level. Moss covered everything. The air smelled of rot and growth in equal measure. I hiked for 2 hours, following the ridgeline, marking GPS points, taking photographs. Normal work. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Not by animals. I'd spent enough time in woods to recognize that particular awareness. This was different. This felt like attention, focused and patient. Around 1 in the afternoon, I stopped for water near a distinctive rock formation. 3 stones stacked naturally in a way that looked almost deliberate. That's when I noticed the marks on the trees. They were carved into the bark at roughly eye level, repeated every 20 feet or so. 3 parallel lines, vertical, each about 6 inches long. Fresh cuts, sap still weeping. They formed a perimeter around the hollow, a boundary line that someone had laboriously carved by hand. I followed the marks for a 1/4 mile, documenting them before returning to the hollow. The sun was starting its descent, shadows lengthening across the valley. I decided to check the other houses before the light failed. The second house was similar to the first, abandoned mid-routine, doors unlocked, possessions left behind. But in the bedroom, I found something that made my skin crawl. Every window had been nailed shut from the inside. Not boarded over, there was still glass, but 6-inch nails driven through the frames at angles that would make them impossible to open. Dozens of nails per window, driven with enough force to split the old wood. The third house was worse. The windows weren't just nailed shut, they were covered from the inside with pages torn from Bibles, taped and pasted in overlapping layers so thick no light could penetrate. The verses were all from the same book. Ephesians chapter 6. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers. I left that house quickly. Back at my truck, I decided to review the camera footage before making any decisions about whether to continue the survey. I had a portable monitor in my equipment kit, so I sat in the cab, connected the camera, and pressed play. The first hour was mundane. The interior of the main house, dated 3 weeks prior, showing an elderly man eating breakfast. The camera operator, presumably another resident, said nothing. The old man looked directly at the lens once and shook his head slowly. Then the footage jumped to nighttime exterior shots. The camera was positioned facing the tree line, infrared mode activated. For long stretches, nothing happened. Then, at the 43-minute mark, something appeared at the edge of the frame. It was tall. That was the first thing I registered. taller than any person, visible from approximately the waist up behind a deadfall log at the forest edge. But it wasn't moving like something that had walked there. It was just present. One frame absent, the next frame there, as if it had materialized. The infrared gave it a ghostly quality, pale and eyeless, or perhaps the eyes simply didn't reflect light the way they should. It remained motionless for 11 minutes. I timed it. 11 minutes of absolute stillness, facing the camera or facing the houses. The angle made it impossible to tell which. Then it was gone. Not walking away, not ducking down. Simply absent in the next frame. The footage continued for another hour, then jumped to a different night. This time, there were 3 of them. Spaced out along the tree line, equally tall, equally still. They appeared at 2:47 a.m. according to the timestamp and remained until 4:12 a.m. when the sky began to lighten. Then they were gone. I watched 6 weeks of footage in compressed time. The pattern was consistent. The figures appeared only at night, only in darkness, and only watching. They never approached closer than the tree line. They never made sound, but their numbers increased. By the final week of footage, there were dozens of them, a silent audience ringing the entire hollow, visible only when the camera panned across the forest edge. The residents had clearly been aware. Later footage showed them moving only between houses during daylight, walking quickly, looking over their shoulders. One clip showed the elderly man from the breakfast scene hammering those nails into the window frames, working with desperate speed. The final video was dated September 18th, the same date circled on the calendar. It was filmed at dawn. The camera was handheld, pointed at the assembled residents. 7 people, all elderly, all carrying backpacks. The person filming spoke for the first time. "This is Evelyn Cutter. It's Tuesday morning, September 18th, 2018. We're leaving. We don't know if we'll make it to Pritchard's Ridge, but we're not staying another night. If someone finds this, you need to understand. They're getting closer. Last night they were 20 feet from the porch. The marks don't hold them anymore. The prayers don't work. We think they're waiting for something. Or someone. Don't be alone here after dark." The video ended. I sat in my truck as the shadows grew long across Cutter's Hollow, looking at those tree lines, at the gaps between trunks, at the darkness gathering beneath the canopy. The camera in my hands suddenly felt heavy with implication. If the residents had left it behind, had set it up by the creek still recording, what had they seen that made even documentation pointless? I made the decision then that probably saved my life. I started my truck and left, driving faster than wise on that ruined logging road, not stopping until I reached paved highway 40 minutes later. I reported everything to the county, the abandoned settlement, the note, the footage. A state police welfare check was conducted 2 days later. They found Cutter's Hollow, exactly as I described it, but they also found the trail camera footage. All 11 cameras. None of them showed anything but wildlife and weather. No figures, no watchers, just empty forest. The digital video camera I'd taken was reviewed by a forensic video analyst who found no evidence of tampering but also couldn't explain several anomalies in the footage. Light levels that didn't match the timestamps, infrared signatures that didn't correspond to any known animal, and metadata suggesting some clips had been recorded hours before the time displayed. The 7 residents of Cutter's Hollow were never found. Search and rescue teams combed Pritchard's Ridge and the surrounding areas for 2 weeks. They found no bodies, no evidence of passage, no sign that 7 elderly people had ever attempted the hike. It was as if they'd walked into the forest and ceased to exist. The county eventually declared them missing persons, presumed dead, likely due to exposure or accident. The hollow itself was absorbed into the land trust, permanently closed to public access. Official reason, environmental sensitivity. Actual reason, I read the internal memos. Too many rangers reported unease while patrolling the area. Equipment malfunctions, missing time, the sense of being watched. I never went back. I transferred to a different district 6 months later, took assignments in flat country where you can see the horizon, where the trees are young and the towns have streetlights. But I kept one thing from that day. The camera was eventually returned to me after the investigation closed. Late at night, when I can't sleep, I still go through that footage, frame by frame, looking at those figures at the tree line. Because there's one detail I never reported, one thing I noticed during my last review that I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone. In the final shot, the one filmed at dawn on September 18th, you can see the forest behind the assembled residents as they prepare to leave. And if you enhance the image, if you zoom into the shadows between the trees, you can see them there. Dozens of them. Not at the tree line anymore. Closer. Much closer. Standing in the gaps between the houses, in the spaces the camera didn't quite focus on, in the morning shadows that shouldn't have been deep enough to hide anything. They were already inside the hollow. The official conclusion is that 7 people wandered off and died in the wilderness. I know different. Whatever was in those woods wasn't content to watch anymore. And the fact that we found the cameras, found the houses, found everything except the people tells me something worse. That whatever took them wanted us to know. Wanted that footage found. Wanted someone to understand that there are places in these mountains where the boundary between here and somewhere else has worn thin, and if you stay too long, if you ignore the warnings, you'll discover what's been waiting on the other side. If you've ever found a place that felt wrong, that radiated wrongness like cold from ice, listen to that instinct. Because sometimes the reason a place is abandoned isn't that people left. Sometimes it's that something else arrived. The patient in room 9 had been dead for 3 hours when she pressed the call button. I was standing at the nurse's station, finishing charting, when the light above her door illuminated with that soft chime they all make. I looked at the monitor. Room 9, call button activated, 2:47 a.m. I stood there for 5 seconds, trying to make that information make sense, before my training took over and I started walking toward the room. My name is Sarah Kellerman. I'm 29 years old, and I'd been a night shift nurse at a Harmon Medical Center for 6 years. Harmon is a small critical access hospital in Grundy, Virginia, serving a population spread across 3 counties of deep Appalachia. 20 beds, skeleton crew at night, the kind of place where you learn to handle everything from cardiac arrests to psychiatric crises with minimal backup. I'd always been proud of that competence, of my ability to stay calm when things went sideways, but nothing in my training prepared me for what happened during the last 2 weeks of October 2019. Harmon Medical was built in 1962 on the site of the old Buchanan County Poor Farm, one of those grim institutions where indigent and mentally ill people were essentially warehoused until they died. The Poor Farm operated from 1904 to 1958, and by all accounts it was exactly as bad as you'd imagine. Overcrowded, understaffed, with minimal medical care, and a cemetery out back that held over 200 unmarked graves. When they built the hospital, they left the cemetery. It's still there. A weedy patch behind the maintenance building, cordoned off with a chain-link fence that's mostly collapsed. I used to eat lunch there sometimes during my orientation, before I knew the history, because it was quiet and shaded. One of the older nurses saw me back there and told me, kindly but firmly, that staff didn't go to that area. She didn't explain why. She didn't have to. After that, I felt it. The heaviness in the air, the sense of intrusion, like sitting in a room where you're not welcome. But inside the hospital, things had always felt normal, clinical, safe, until October 15th, when Margaret Sutherland died. Margaret was 73, end-stage COPD, a regular patient who'd been admitted 4 times that year. She was kind, uncomplaining, the type who apologized for needing help. She'd been on my unit for 8 days, stable enough that we'd been planning discharge to a nursing facility. She died suddenly around 11:30 p.m. A pulmonary embolism, massive and fast. I was there. I held her hand while the doctor called time of death at 11:47 p.m. Her family wasn't there. They lived 3 hours away and had been planning to visit the next morning. We called them. They were devastated but asked us to keep her comfortable until they could arrive by dawn to make arrangements. So Margaret stayed in room 9, covered respectfully. The room dimmed while we waited for her family. I was back at the station around 2:30, talking with Jake Holcomb, our night shift orderly, when the call light went on. Jake saw it too. We both stared at that light, then at each other. "Equipment malfunction," he said, but his voice had no conviction. I walked to room 9 and pushed the door open slowly. The room was exactly as we'd left it. Margaret's body still uncovered, flowers on the windowsill, the monitors off. The call button hung from its cord beside the bed, swaying slightly, as if it had just been released. I checked everything. The button mechanism, the electrical connections, anything that might explain a false activation. Nothing. I even pressed it myself to confirm it was working, and the light at the station obediently lit up. Jake came to help, and we spent 10 minutes troubleshooting before giving up. "Old wiring," I said. "Yeah," Jake agreed too quickly. We returned to the station. At 3:15 a.m., the call light from room 9 activated again. This time I walked down there angry, convinced there was an electrical short we'd missed. I pushed into the room ready to disconnect the whole system, and stopped. The blanket had been pulled down. Not off, not disturbed like someone thrashing or moving. Just pulled neatly down to Margaret's waist, folded carefully, the way you would if you were hot and wanted to cool off. Jake was right behind me. He saw it too. "Did you?" he started. "No." "Good air pressure from the door?" "No." We stood there, two rational people trying to apply rational explanations to something that permitted none. Finally, I pulled the blanket back up, tucked it in tightly, and we left. I unplugged the call button at the wall plate. Problem solved. At 4:02 a.m., I was walking past room 9 to check on another patient when I heard it. A voice, muffled, coming from inside. Speaking. I opened the door. Margaret's body was still covered, still motionless, but the voice was there, faint but distinct, coming from her. Not words, just sound, a rhythmic murmuring, the cadence of speech without language. I stood frozen, listening to a dead woman's voice emanate from beneath that blanket, and some part of my brain simply refused to process it. Then it stopped, and the silence that followed was somehow worse. I backed out and pulled the door closed. At the station, I told Jake what I'd heard. He looked at me like I'd confessed to something shameful. "You're exhausted," he said. "Double shift yesterday, now this. It's been a long night." I wanted to believe him, but at 5:20 a.m., just before dawn, we both heard it. Not from room 9 this time, but from the hallway. Footsteps, the distinctive shuffle click of someone walking with an IV pole. The hallway was empty. All our patients were accounted for, asleep or watching TV in their rooms. But the sound continued, passing the station, heading toward the exit. We followed it, both of us now, walking quickly down the corridor toward the automatic doors that led to the parking lot. The sound stopped at the doors. We watched them, waiting for them to activate, to slide open. They didn't, but through the glass, in the pre-dawn darkness, we saw something move. A figure, indistinct, wearing what looked like a hospital gown, walking across the parking lot toward the tree line beyond. By the time we got outside, there was nothing, just empty asphalt and the distant sound of morning birds. Margaret's family arrived at 6:30. We released her body to the funeral home by 8. I went home and slept poorly, dreaming of that figure walking into the woods. When I returned for my next shift 3 nights later, the charge nurse pulled me aside. "Room 9, she said. "We've had issues." 2 patients had been placed there since Margaret's death. Both had requested transfer to different rooms within hours, complaining of feeling watched and hearing whispers. The second patient, a man recovering from a broken hip, had become so agitated that they'd moved him to the other wing and sedated him. He kept saying someone was standing at the foot of his bed, a woman asking him questions he couldn't understand. "I need you to document everything," the charge nurse said. "Administration wants a record before they call maintenance to check for carbon monoxide or mold or whatever might be causing hallucinations." That night, I was assigned to the wing that included room 9. We had a new patient there, Daniel Griffith, 41, admitted for diabetic ketoacidosis, stable and oriented. I checked on him at 10 p.m. He was watching television, cheerful, thanking me for the care. At midnight, his call light went on. When I entered, he was sitting upright in bed, staring at the corner of the room near the bathroom. "Who is that?" he asked. "Who is who, Daniel?" "The woman. Right there. She's been standing there for 20 minutes. I looked. The corner was empty. There's no one there. She's wearing a blue gown. She's old. She keeps trying to talk, but I can't hear her." I checked his vitals, his blood sugar, everything. All normal. "You might be dreaming," I suggested gently. "I'm not asleep." I stayed with him for 15 minutes, talking, reassuring. The whole time, his eyes kept drifting to that corner, following something I couldn't see. At 2 a.m., I heard a crash from room 9. I ran down to find Daniel on the floor beside his bed, tangled in his IV line, bleeding from a gash on his forehead. He was trying to crawl toward the door. "She touched me," he gasped. "She put her hand on my arm, and it was cold. Jesus Christ, it was cold, and I saw... Saw what?" But he couldn't articulate it. We moved him to a different room, stitched his forehead, and he refused to speak about it further. He checked out AMA the next morning, against medical advice, still wearing his hospital gown, so desperate to leave he wouldn't wait for discharge paperwork. That's when the hospital brought in Father Donnelly. Father Donnelly was a Catholic priest from the church in town. Probably in his late 60s, the kind of man who'd seen everything twice and believed in things he couldn't prove. The administration didn't officially request an exorcism. They called it a blessing of the facility, but everyone knew what they were really asking for. I was there when he walked through room 9. He was silent for a long time, standing in the center, eyes closed. Finally, he said, "This room is fine. The presence isn't here." "Where is it?" the administrator asked. Father Donnelly walked out of the room down the hallway, and we followed him like a bizarre procession. He moved with certainty, turning corners, descending the stairwell to the ground floor. He walked through the maintenance corridors, past storage, past the laundry, until he reached the back exit that led to the old cemetery. "There," he said, pointing through the window at that weedy, forgotten patch of ground. "That's where they are. All of them." "All of them?" I asked. He looked at me with something like pity. "Did you think it was just one?" He performed the blessing the next day during the afternoon when the hospital was busy and most people were too occupied to notice. I wasn't on shift, but Jake told me about it later. Father Donnelly went to every room, every corridor, every corner of the building, saying prayers and sprinkling holy water. When he reached the cemetery, he spent an hour out there alone, praying over the ground. It worked for 3 days. On the 4th night after the blessing, I was back on shift, and at 2:47 a.m., the exact time Margaret's call button had first activated, every call light in the hospital illuminated simultaneously. Every single room. The console at the nurse's station lit up like a Christmas tree, chiming frantically 24 rooms all calling at once. We ran to check them. Every patient was asleep or confused about why we were there. No one had pressed anything, and in every room, the temperature had dropped. Not slightly. We're talking from 72 degrees to 50-something in a matter of minutes. You could see breath misting. Then the lights went out. Emergency generators kicked in immediately, but for about 10 seconds we were in complete darkness, and in that darkness I heard them. Footsteps. Dozens of them. Walking through hallways, through walls, through rooms. The shuffle of the sick, the dying, the abandoned. And under it, that murmuring. The sound I'd heard from Margaret's room, but multiplied. A chorus of voices speaking in that wordless cadence. When the lights came back, it stopped. The temperature normalized. The call lights went dark. Everything returned to normal so abruptly it felt like waking from a nightmare. Except for room 9. In room 9, which was unoccupied, we found the bed stripped completely, the linens piled in the center of the mattress, and on the whiteboard where we write patient information, someone had written in shaky handwriting, "We remember." The hospital administration closed the wing for renovations the next week. They never reopened it. 6 months later, Harmon Medical Center announced it was relocating to a new facility 3 miles away, a modern building on cleared land with no history. The official reason was infrastructure upgrades. But every staff member who worked that October knows the truth. I transferred to the new facility and I still work night shifts, but I've never seen anything like those 2 weeks again. The new hospital feels clean, empty of anything but the living and the recently dead. But sometimes, on very quiet nights when I'm walking the corridors alone, I think about what Father Donnelly said. All of them. 200 unmarked graves. 200 people who died in misery, uncounted and unremembered, buried in a field that became a parking lot, a maintenance building, a forgotten corner behind a chain-link fence. The official story is that the hospital relocated for practical reasons, that the old building was simply outdated. I've never contradicted that story publicly, but I know what I experienced, what we all experienced. Places remember trauma, buildings absorb suffering, and sometimes, when you build over graves, when you try to civilize ground that holds too much pain, those who were forgotten find ways to remind you they're still there. If you ever work in an old hospital, especially one built on difficult ground, pay attention to the rooms no one wants to stay in. Listen to patients when they say they see someone you can't. Because sometimes they're not hallucinating. Sometimes they're seeing exactly what's there, and the only question is why you can't see it too. The emergency broadcast came through at 11:34 p.m. on a frequency that shouldn't have existed. I was sitting in my monitoring station, a cramped room in the basement of the FCC field office in Bluefield, West Virginia, running routine overnight scans of the radio spectrum. Standard procedure, checking for unauthorized transmissions, signal interference, pirate broadcasters, anything that might violate federal communications law. It's boring work, 99% static and silence, but it pays well and the night differential suited my preference for solitude. Then every monitoring system I'd lit up simultaneously, all of them locked onto a single frequency, 1670 AM. A frequency allocated to low-power travelers' information stations, usually broadcasting automated weather or traffic updates within a 5-mile radius. Nothing that should produce the signal strength I was seeing. The transmission was coming in so powerfully it was overriding everything else in the spectrum, a focused blast of RF energy that had no business existing at that intensity on that band. I'm Owen Pritchard, 36 years old, and I'd worked for the FCC's Enforcement Division for 11 years. I'd tracked down illegal radio operators in 3 states, testified in federal court about signal analysis, and prided myself on understanding exactly how radio worked. The physics, the regulations, the limitations. I knew what was possible and what wasn't. This transmission wasn't possible. I put on my headphones and listened. For the first 30 seconds, it was just carrier wave. Pure tone, no modulation, no information. Then a voice emerged. Male, calm, speaking with the measured cadence of a professional broadcaster. This is an emergency message from the Kettle Mountain monitoring station. If you can hear this broadcast, you need to understand what's happening. This is not a drill. This is not a test. What we found up here was never meant to be disturbed, and now it's spreading. The contamination is moving down the mountain. Evacuate the valley communities immediately. Repeat. Evacuate Braxton Hollow, Lowe's Fork, and Kettle Ridge before dawn. This is a final warning from station WKTL Kettle Mountain. God help anyone who doesn't listen. Then it cut to static. I sat there, hands frozen on my equipment, trying to process what I'd just heard. WKTL wasn't a call sign in my database. Kettle Mountain was real, a 200-foot peak in the Appalachian range about 40 miles northeast of Bluefield. But there was no monitoring station there. No broadcast facility, no FCC license, nothing. I pulled up topographical maps and overlaid them with FCC registration data. Kettle Mountain was designated National Forest Land, primitive area, no development. The communities mentioned, Braxton Hollow, Lowe's Fork, Kettle Ridge, were real, tiny, unincorporated areas scattered through the valleys around the mountain. Combined population, maybe 200 people. The transmission repeated at 11:47 p.m., exactly the same message, word for word, same voice, same urgent but controlled delivery. I recorded it, ran spectral analysis, tried to triangulate the source. The signal was definitely coming from Kettle Mountain, somewhere near the summit, broadcast with at least 5,000 watts of power, far beyond what a traveler's information station should produce. I called my supervisor, got voicemail, called the local sheriff's department in Tazewell County. This is Owen Pritchard with the Federal Communications Commission. I'm receiving an emergency broadcast that's claiming there's some kind of contamination event on Kettle Mountain. Are you aware of any situation up there? The dispatcher sounded annoyed. Sir, there's nothing happening on Kettle Mountain. It's national forest. No one lives up there. The broadcast is mentioning communities in the area. Braxton Hollow, Lowe's Fork. Those are real places, yes, but we haven't received any emergency calls. You sure this isn't some kind of prank? We get a lot of that around Halloween. It was October 23rd, close enough to Halloween that the explanation made sense, except nothing about the signal analysis suggested a prank. The power, the frequency stability, the professional quality of the broadcast. This was sophisticated equipment, expensive equipment, operated by someone who knew what they were doing. The transmission repeated at midnight, then again at 12:13 a.m., each time identical, each time overriding every other signal in range. At 12:30 a.m. it changed. The voice was the same, but the message was different. This is WKTL Kettle Mountain. The situation has deteriorated. Repeat, the situation has deteriorated. The barrier we established has failed. We estimate contamination spread at approximately 1 mile per hour. Communities within 5 miles should evacuate immediately. Do not approach the mountain. Do not attempt rescue operations. Anyone experiencing symptoms, disorientation, auditory hallucinations, compulsion to approach the source, should distance themselves immediately. This will be our final broadcast. We're shutting down the station and evacuating. God help us all. Then silence. Not static, not carrier wave. Complete radio silence on 1670 AM. I tried calling the sheriff again, got the same dispatcher, repeated what I'd heard. She took my information, but I could hear the skepticism in her voice. To her, I was just another crank with a radio, reporting something probably generated by college kids with a transmitter and too much time. But I couldn't let it go. I'm not a field agent. My job was monitoring, Not enforcement, but I had mobile direction-finding equipment in my vehicle, enough to track a signal to its source. The transmission had stopped, but if the equipment was still up there broadcasting carrier wave, even low level, I could find it. I made a decision that probably saved my life and definitely ended my career with the FCC. I left my monitoring station, loaded my gear, and started driving toward Kettle Mountain. The route took me through increasingly isolated terrain. State highways, narrowing to county roads, narrowing to gravel tracks. I reached the base of Kettle Mountain around 2:30 in the morning, parking at a National Forest access point that marked the trailhead to the summit. My direction-finding equipment was picking up faint RF noise from somewhere up the mountain. Directionless, ambient, like the electromagnetic echo of the earlier transmission. I hiked. The trail was poorly maintained, overgrown in places, marked by faded blazes on trees. My flashlight cut a narrow tunnel through darkness so complete it felt solid. The only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional rustle of night animals moving through underbrush. After 90 minutes, I found the road. It wasn't on any map. It was cut into the mountainside, a single-lane gravel track switchbacking upward, recent enough that vegetation hadn't fully reclaimed it, and it led to something that stopped me cold. A gate, chain link, 10 feet high, topped with razor wire, padlocked. A sign mounted on the fence read, "Restricted area, authorized personnel only, U.S. government property." Beyond the gate, the road continued upward, and I could see light, electric light, artificial, coming from somewhere near the summit. I called the sheriff's department again. Different dispatcher this time, night shift change. I'm on Kettle Mountain and I found some kind of government facility. There's a fence, a road, lights. You need to send someone up here. Sir, there's no facility on Kettle Mountain. I'm looking right at it. Silence on the line. Then, stay where you are. I'm sending a deputy. I waited by the gate, watching that light through the trees, checking my equipment. The RF noise was stronger here, a buzz in the spectrum that sounded almost organic, like electronic insect sounds. It was messing with my direction-finding gear, scattering readings, making it impossible to get a precise fix. Then I heard the sound. It came from upslope, beyond the gate, a low rhythmic pulse that I felt as much as heard. Not mechanical. No engine, no generator hum. This was different. It resonated in my chest, made my teeth ache, set off a primal alarm system that screamed danger. The light through the trees flickered, not like electrical failure, but deliberately, in a pattern. Long, short, long. Long, short, long. SOS. Someone up there was signaling for help. I did something I knew was illegal and probably insane. I climbed the fence. The razor wire tore my jacket and sliced my hand, but I got over, dropped onto the access road on the other side, and started walking toward the summit. The road climbed for another half-mile before opening into a clearing. What I found there wasn't a broadcast facility. It was a research station, modular buildings arranged in a compound, satellite dishes, a communications tower, and vehicles parked in neat rows. Lights were on in several structures, generators running but no movement. No people. A sign near the main building read, "Appalachian Acoustic Research Project, Depth of Interior, Authorized Access Only." Acoustic research, on a mountain in the middle of nowhere. The door to the main building was ajar. I pushed it open and called out. No response. Inside was a standard field research setup. Computers, monitoring equipment, bunks, kitchen area. Coffee still hot in the maker. Dinner dishes in the sink. Like everyone had just stepped out. The computers were still running, screens displaying waveform data I didn't understand. But one screen showed a simple text message, typed in what looked like haste. Audio signature confirmed as non-human. Origin point subsurface. Approx 1200 FT below summit. Resonance cascade effect beginning at 2317. HR's evacuation ordered. If you're reading this, do not investigate further. The frequency causes neurological compulsion. Leave immediately. The timestamp was 11:23 p.m., 11 minutes before I'd picked up that emergency broadcast. I should have left. Every instinct was screaming at me to run. But I needed to understand what they'd been researching, what could cause trained scientists to broadcast an emergency warning and then abandon a federal facility. I found the answer in the communications room. The broadcast equipment was there, sophisticated and expensive, and beside it was a reel-to-reel tape player. A tape was loaded, the reel still turning slowly, playing to an empty room. I stopped the tape and rewound it. The label read, "Specimen audio, frequency isolated, do not broadcast." I pressed play. For 5 seconds, there was nothing. Then I heard it. A sound like singing, if singing could be done by something that had never been alive. It was harmonic, layered, beautiful in a way that made me nauseous. And under it, barely audible, words. Not English, not any language. But I understood them anyway, the way you understand a dream. Meaning, without translation, come down, come to us, come below. I stopped the tape and backed away from the player so fast I knocked over a chair. My head was pounding, a migraine blooming behind my eyes, and I felt it. The compulsion they'd mentioned. The overwhelming urge to leave the building, to walk into the forest, to find the source of that sound and go to it. I ran. Out of the building, across the compound, down the access road, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Behind me, I heard something that couldn't be there. Voices, dozens of them, calling my name, telling me to come back, to listen, to understand. I hit the fence at a full sprint, threw myself over it without caring about the wire, and didn't stop running until I reached my vehicle. My hand was bleeding badly, my jacket shredded, and when I looked at my direction-finding equipment, it had shorted out completely, sparking and smoking in the passenger seat. I drove. Until I reached the sheriff's office in Tazewell and walked in, bloody and babbling, to a deputy who looked at me like I'd lost my mind. I told him everything. The broadcast, the facility, the tape, the compound. He took a statement, called someone, and within an hour, federal agents arrived. Homeland Security, Department of Interior. People who wouldn't identify their agency. They confiscated my equipment, my recordings, everything. They questioned me for 6 hours. The same questions over and over, trying to determine what I'd seen, what I'd heard, what I remembered. When I mentioned the tape, they stopped asking questions. They told me I'd trespassed on a restricted research site, that I'd compromised an ongoing acoustic study of seismic activity, that the emergency broadcast was the equipment malfunction that triggered an automated message. They threatened federal charges if I spoke about it publicly. I was released with a warning, a non-disclosure agreement I had no choice but to sign, and a strong suggestion that I find a different line of work. The official story, the one that made local news briefly, was that the Appalachian Acoustic Research Project was a USGS seismic monitoring station studying earthquake prediction in the region. The facility on Kettle Mountain was decommissioned shortly after, due to budgetary constraints. The communities in the valley, Braxton Hollow, Lowe's Fork, Kettle Ridge, were never evacuated. No emergency was declared. Nothing happened. But I did my own research later, carefully, through channels that couldn't be traced to me. Kettle Mountain has a history. In 1957, a team of spelunkers found a cave system near the summit and descended approximately 800 feet before abandoning the exploration. In their report, filed with the National Speleological Society, they noted unusual acoustic properties and sounds of unknown origin from deeper sections they didn't explore. The cave was sealed by the Forest Service in 1958, officially due to collapse risk. In 1973, a group of hikers disappeared on Kettle Mountain. 5 people, experienced outdoorsmen, vanished without a trace. Search and rescue found their camp intact, supplies untouched, but no sign of the hikers. The official conclusion was exposure and misadventure, though the bodies were never found. And in 1983, a fire lookout stationed on Kettle Mountain reported hearing singing from underground for 3 consecutive nights before requesting immediate transfer. He was treated for a psychiatric break and the lookout tower was permanently closed. I don't work for the FCC anymore. I took a job with a private communications company, handling equipment installation, nothing that requires monitoring radio frequencies late at night. I sleep better now. Mostly. But sometimes I think about what I heard on that tape, that sound that wasn't quite music, wasn't quite language, and I wonder what's still down there below Kettle Mountain, in caves we sealed because we found something we couldn't explain. And I think about that message, typed in haste by researchers who knew they were in danger. The frequency causes neurological compulsion. They broadcast a warning to keep people away. But what if the warning was already too late? What if exposure to that sound, even recorded, even filtered through electronics, created a permanent connection? Because sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. Faint but unmistakable. Calling from somewhere deep below the ground. Singing in a voice that was never human. I feel it, that pull, that urge to get in my car and drive to Kettle Mountain, to find the sealed cave, to go down into the dark and discover what's been waiting there. If you ever pick up a strange radio signal, something that doesn't match any known station, turn it off. Don't listen. Don't record it. And especially don't go looking for the source. Because some things broadcast for a reason, and sometimes that reason is to lure you in. The candles were still burning when we found the church, all 97 of them, lined along the pews and windowsills, flames steady in the still air. But the doors had been locked from the inside, and everyone who'd attended the Sunday service had been dead for at least 12 hours. I'm Detective Amy Vasquez, 42 years old, and I'd been with the West Virginia State Police for 19 years when I caught the Greer Chapel case. I worked major crimes out of the Beckley detachment, covering Raleigh County and the surrounding area. Mostly drug-related violence, domestic homicides, the occasional suspicious death in the mining communities that dotted the region. I'd seen bodies in every condition, every cause of death, and I thought nothing could surprise me anymore. Greer Chapel proved me wrong. The call came in on a Monday morning, October 7th, 2017. A family member had driven to the church looking for their mother, who'd attended service the previous morning and never came home. The church was a small independent congregation, unaffiliated with any larger denomination, serving a community of about 30 families scattered through the hollers around Greer, West Virginia. One of those places that's barely a town, just a post office and a general store at a crossroads. When I arrived, there were already 3 county sheriff's deputies on scene, standing outside the white clapboard building, looking uncomfortable. The senior deputy, a man named Carlson I'd worked with before, met me at my vehicle. "We haven't gone in," he said, "but you can see through the windows. You need to see it." I approached the church. It was a simple structure, probably built in the 1920s, maintained but aging, with a small steeple and 6 tall windows along each side. Through the glass, I could see the interior, wooden pews, a simple altar, and people. At least 24 people sitting in the pews as if listening to a sermon, perfectly still. "Have you tried to make contact?" I asked. "We've been shouting, banging on the doors." No response. "And detective, they're not moving. Not at all." I tried the front doors. Solid wood, locked, no give. I circled the building, the back entrance, a side door, all locked. And through every window, the same scene. Motionless figures lit by candlelight, arranged in the pews as if waiting. I made the decision to force entry. We used a battering ram on the front doors, a controlled breach, and the lock shattered on the second impact. The doors swung inward and we smelled it immediately. Not decomposition, not yet, but something else. Candle wax, old wood, and underneath it a strange metallic sweetness I couldn't identify. We entered with weapons drawn, calling out identifications, announcing our presence. No response. The church interior was exactly as it appeared from outside. 27 people sitting in the pews, all dressed in Sunday clothes. Men in suits, women in dresses, even a few children, all motionless, all dead. But they weren't slumped or collapsed. They were sitting upright, hands folded in laps or resting on the pew backs in front of them, eyes open, facing the altar, as if they'd simply stopped living mid-service, frozen in place. I approached the nearest body, an elderly woman in the front row. No visible trauma, no signs of struggle. Her skin was pale, lips slightly blue, consistent with death by several hours. I checked for a pulse, knowing I wouldn't find one. Her skin was cold, muscles stiff. Rigor mortis, well established. Every body in the church was the same. Men, women, children ranging from around 8 to late 70s. All positioned naturally, all showing signs of having been dead since sometime the previous day. And all the candles were still burning, 97 of them. We counted later. White candles of various sizes, some burned down to stubs, others still half full, but all lit, all producing that steady yellow light. On the altar, a Bible lay open to the book of Revelation, chapter 6. The passage about the pale horse and the rider named Death. Beside it, a handwritten note on church letterhead. The congregation of Greer Chapel enters into the promise. We go willingly, joyfully, to meet what was prophesied. Do not mourn us, we have seen the truth. Pastor Nehemiah Greer, October 6, 2017. We secured the scene and called for backup. Coroner, crime scene techs, additional investigators. This wasn't just a death investigation. This was a mass fatality event, potentially criminal, definitely requiring resources we didn't have on hand. While we waited, I interviewed the person who'd made the initial call, Patricia Hendricks, whose mother, Eleanor, was among the dead. Patricia lived in Charleston, about an hour away, and visited her mother weekly. She called me Saturday night, Patricia said, hands shaking. She said there was going to be a special service Sunday morning, that Pastor Greer had received a revelation that everyone needed to be there. She sounded excited, happy. I asked her what it was about, and she said I'd understand soon, that everyone would. I thought she meant he was announcing his retirement or something. Mom was 71. She'd been going to that church her whole life. Did your mother mention anything unusual happening at the church recently? I asked. Patricia hesitated. She'd mentioned that Pastor Greer had been acting different the past few weeks. More intense. He'd always been a fire and brimstone type. Lots of talk about the end times, but she said recently he'd started talking about specific dates, about signs he'd seen. She thought maybe he was getting senile. He was in his 80s. Pastor Nehemiah Greer was sitting in the front pew, closest to the altar. A thin man in a black suit, head tilted back slightly, eyes open and fixed on the ceiling. In his lap was a leather journal, handwritten pages visible. I photographed it in place, then carefully extracted it. The journal was dated, entries going back 3 months. I read it later, after the bodies had been removed, in the quiet of the state police barracks, and it was one of the most disturbing documents I've ever encountered. The early entries were mundane. Sermon notes, Bible verses, reflections on scripture. But starting in early August, the tone changed. August 9th, heard it again last night. The sound from below the church. like singing, but not human voices. I have prayed for understanding. August 14th. The sound is clearer now. It's calling to me. I believe it is a message, a revelation meant for this congregation specifically. August 21. I've been shown what lies beneath. We built this church over sacred ground, though we didn't know it. The old ones are still here, waiting. They have a covenant to offer. August 29th. I have seen them in dreams. They show me the future. Fire, collapse, suffering. But they offer escape. A passage, if we are willing. The entries became increasingly apocalyptic, filled with references to visions, voices from beneath the church, and a growing conviction that the congregation had been chosen for something he called the translation. The final entry, dated October 6th, the morning of the last service. Today we fulfill the covenant. I prepared the sacrament as instructed. The congregation will drink, we will pray, and we will pass through together. I have no fear. What waits on the other side is glorious. To those who find us, do not grieve. We are not dead. We have merely stepped through a door you cannot see. The coroner arrived and began preliminary examinations. His initial assessment, delivered in the church parking lot, was professional but clearly shaken. No visible trauma on any victim, no signs of violence or struggle. Pupils are dilated in all cases. Skin shows some cyanosis. My preliminary guess, pending toxicology, is poisoning. Something that caused rapid cardiac and respiratory arrest, but allowed them to remain conscious and upright briefly before death. We'll need autopsies, but if I had to guess right now, I'd say cyanide or something similar, probably delivered in a drink. We searched the church. In the small kitchen area behind the sanctuary, we found a metal pitcher and 27 small cups arranged on a tray, communion cups. Residue in the cups, residue in the pitcher, all sent for testing. We also searched the basement. The basement access was through a narrow stairway behind the altar, door unlocked. It was unfinished space, dirt floor, stone foundation walls used for storage, boxes of hymnals, old furniture, heating system, nothing unusual, except for the hole. Someone had dug into the floor in the far corner of the basement, a rough excavation about 3 feet wide, descending at an angle. It went down approximately 6 feet before hitting what looked like natural cave formation. Limestone, typical for the region. The excavation was recent, dirt still loose, tools nearby. Pastor Greer had been digging, looking for something, or trying to reach something. I descended into the hole with a flashlight, far enough to see that it connected to a natural void, a small cave passage extending horizontally into darkness. The air coming from it was cold and damp, and carried a smell I couldn't identify. Mineral, organic, wrong somehow. I didn't explore further. That was a decision for cave rescue specialists, not a detective at a death scene. We photographed it, documented it, and sealed it off. The toxicology results came back 2 weeks later. All 27 victims had died from cyanide poisoning, specifically hydrogen cyanide delivered in a liquid solution. The communion cups contained traces of cyanide mixed with wine. Death would have been relatively quick, minutes, but not instantaneous. Long enough for the poison to circulate, for consciousness to fade while the body remained upright, for each person to die in place. Mass suicide. That was the official conclusion. Pastor Nehemiah Greer had poisoned his entire congregation during a Sunday service, and they'd taken the poison willingly, believing they were fulfilling some kind of religious prophecy. But the investigation revealed complications. Interviews with family members of the deceased showed that none of them had exhibited cult-like behavior. They were normal people. Farmers, teachers, store clerks, retirees. The church wasn't isolated or extreme. Services had been open to anyone. There was no history of the congregation following bizarre doctrines or being controlled by the pastor. And yet 27 people, including children, had drunk poison and died without resistance, without panic, sitting calmly in pews while cyanide stopped their hearts. We interviewed the few congregation members who hadn't attended that final service. 3 families had been away that Sunday, traveling or ill. All expressed shock and disbelief. But one man, Thomas Pritchard, who'd attended Greer Chapel for 40 years, told me something that never made it into the official report. About a month before it happened, I was at the church on a Wednesday evening, helping Pastor Greer with some repairs. We were alone in the sanctuary, and I heard it, singing, coming from below us, from the basement. I asked the pastor about it, and he got this strange look, happy but also scared, and he said, "They're welcoming us, Thomas. We're the ones they've been waiting for." I thought he was going senile, speaking in metaphor. I didn't go back after that. When I heard about the service, about what happened, I wondered if he'd really heard something, if they all had. I went back to Greer Chapel one more time, 3 months after the incident, before it was demolished. The property had been purchased by the county, and the decision was made to tear down the building and consecrate the land. Too much death, too much horror for the structure to ever be used again. I went into the basement alone, against protocol, and I stood at the edge of that excavation. During the investigation, we'd had a speleologist examine the cave passage. He'd gone in about 50 feet before stopping, reporting that the passage continued but was too unstable to explore safely. He noted unusual acoustic properties and a smell he described as organic decay, but not recent. Standing there in the empty basement, I listened. For a long time, I heard nothing. Then, faintly, so faintly I might have imagined it, I heard something that could have been singing. Harmonic, layered, beautiful, coming from deep below. I left immediately, and I've never spoken about it. The church was demolished the following week. The basement was filled in. The site was covered with topsoil and planted with grass. There's a historical marker there now, noting that Greer Chapel once stood on the site, a place of worship for over 90 years, closed due to tragedy. The official conclusion is that Pastor Nehemiah Greer suffered a psychotic break, developed a delusional belief system, and manipulated his congregation into a mass suicide through religious fervor and authority. It's a conclusion supported by evidence, by his journal, by the toxicology reports. But I've read that journal completely. Every entry, including the parts we didn't release to the public. And in those final weeks, Pastor Greer described things he couldn't have imagined, details about what he saw beneath the church, entities he claimed had spoken to him, specific instructions for the ritual. He wrote that they weren't dying. He wrote that the poison was a key, that it would stop their bodies but release something else, allow them to pass through into a place that existed beneath, beyond, below. He wrote that they would continue, transformed, in service to something older than Christianity, older than humanity. 27 people died believing that. 27 people drank poison willingly, sat in pews while their hearts stopped, and died with calm expressions as if they truly expected to wake up somewhere else. I'm a detective. I work with evidence. Facts, provable truth. But sometimes evidence points to conclusions we're not equipped to accept. What if Pastor Greer wasn't delusional? What if he really did hear something beneath that church? Something real, something that spoke to him and made promises? What if those people didn't die at all? Not in the way we understand death, but passed through into something we can't measure or prove? I don't have answers. I have an official case file that says mass suicide, case closed. And I have memories of 27 bodies sitting peacefully in candlelight, of a hole dug into basement floor, of faint singing from deep underground. If you ever hear someone you trust, someone rational and grounded, start talking about voices from below, about revelations from beneath, listen carefully. Because sometimes the people who hear things aren't crazy. Sometimes they're the only ones hearing clearly. And what they hear might be something calling from places we buried and forgot, places we built over, places we pretended didn't exist. The surveyor's stakes were 10 feet inside my boundary when I found them, bright orange plastic topped with ribbons, marking a line that carved through my land in a direction that made no geometric sense. Someone was claiming a piece of my property, and according to the courthouse records I'd checked that afternoon, that someone had been dead for 119 years. I'm Robert Vance, 57 years old, and I'd spent 30 years as a civil engineer in Pittsburgh before retiring to the mountains. I'd bought 23 acres in Pocahontas County, West Virginia, remote and beautiful, with a rebuilt cabin from the 1940s and enough solitude to let me pretend the modern world didn't exist. I'd done my due diligence, title search, survey, boundary verification. The land was legally mine, clear title going back to 1952. The stakes appeared on the morning of November the 3rd, 2020, a cold Tuesday with frost thick on the ground. I'd walked my property line regularly since moving there, a habit from my engineering days, and I knew every marker, every boundary pin. These stakes were new, and they were wrong. They started at the northeast corner of my land, near the tree line that bordered National Forest, and ran southwest at a diagonal that would have bisected my property cleanly, cutting off roughly 5 acres, including the old root cellar and the spring house. Whoever had placed them had done professional work. The line was straight, the stakes positioned with precision, ribbons tied at consistent heights. I pulled up the first stake. Beneath it, driven into the ground, was a rebar pin marked with a surveyor's cap. The cap was embossed with a name, Holloway Surveys, ESTA 1897. I stood there, holding that stake, looking at that cap, trying to make sense of it. Holloway Surveys wasn't a company I'd encountered during my purchase. I photographed the cap, pulled the rebar pin, and moved to the next stake. Same setup, same cap, same name. By the time I'd removed all 17 stakes along that impossible line, I was angry and confused in equal measure. Someone was trying to make a claim on my land, using what appeared to be antique surveying materials to do it. I drove to the county courthouse in Marlinton, brought my photographs and the surveyor's caps, and requested records. The clerk, a woman in her 60s who'd worked there for decades, looked at the name on the cap and went pale. "Holloway," she said quietly. "We haven't seen that name come up in decades." She pulled files. It took her an hour, digging through archives, some of them still on paper, some digitized incompletely. What she finally brought me was a land deed dated 1901, recording a property transfer in the area that would eventually become my land. The surveyor of record was listed as Thaddeus Holloway, licensed surveyor, Pocahontas County. "Is there any current Holloway Survey Company?" I asked. "Thaddeus Holloway died in 1905, the clerk said. "There's no company. There hasn't been for over a century." "Then why is someone using his surveying marks on my property?" She had no answer. She made copies of the historical documents for me and suggested I contact a lawyer. I left the courthouse more unsettled than when I'd arrived. Back at my cabin, I examined the old deed documents. The property described wasn't exactly my land, but it overlapped. A 40-acre parcel purchased by someone named Elijah Marsh in 1901, surveyed by Thaddeus Holloway. Boundaries recorded in the antiquated style of the time using landmarks and distances. The land had been sold and subdivided multiple times over the following decades, eventually becoming the parcel I'd purchased. But there was a notation on the original deed, handwritten in faded ink at the bottom of the page. "Disputed boundary, eastern section, claim pending resolution." The dispute was never resolved in the records. No follow-up documents, no court case, nothing. Just that one notation, left hanging for 119 years. That night, I heard the sounds. I was in the cabin, reading through the copied documents, when I heard it. Metal striking stone, rhythmic and purposeful, coming from outside. I grabbed a flashlight and went onto the porch. The sound was coming from the direction of the property line where I'd pulled the stakes. I walked toward it, flashlight beam cutting through darkness, and found the source. Someone was driving stakes back into the ground. I could see the motion. A figure, tall and dark, swinging something heavy, planting markers. I shouted, "Hey, this is private property!" The figure stopped, turned toward me, and even from 50 feet away, even in the inadequate light of my flashlight, I could see that something was wrong. The proportions weren't right. Too tall, too thin, movements too smooth. I took a step forward and the figure vanished. Not ducking down, not running into the trees. Simply gone, mid-motion. As if someone had switched off a projection. I stood there for 5 minutes, heart pounding, shining my light across the area. Nothing. No sound except wind in the trees. I walked to where I'd seen the figure and found fresh stakes in the ground. Not the ones I'd pulled. These were different. Older. The wood was weathered nearly black, the ribbons faded red fabric that crumbled when I touched it, and the surveyor's caps on these pins were hand-stamped metal, corroded and ancient. T. Holloway, surveyor. I pulled them up. All of them. I carried the stakes back to my cabin and locked the doors, feeling ridiculous and terrified in equal measure. I didn't sleep. At 3:17 a.m., I heard the pounding resume, the sound of stakes being driven into ground. I looked out the window and saw lights in the forest, moving along the disputed line. Lantern light, flickering and yellow, definitely not electric. I didn't go outside. By morning, the stakes were back. 17 of them, old wood and faded ribbons, marking that impossible line across my property. I called a surveyor, a licensed professional from a firm in Elkins. His name was David Chen, mid-40s, practical and no nonsense. I explained the situation, showed him the stakes, showed him the historical documents. He walked the line with GPS equipment and a transit, taking measurements. "The line is accurate," he finally said. "Whoever placed these stakes knew what they were doing. It's surveyed correctly according to the original 1901 deed description. But here's the problem. That deed was superseded by later surveys. This line has no legal standing. Your boundary is correct according to modern records. So someone is trying to claim land based on a century-old dispute? Or someone is very confused about property law," David said. "I can file a report with the county confirming your boundaries if you want an official record." He did the paperwork, photographed everything, and left. I felt slightly better having professional documentation, but it didn't explain who was placing the stakes, or why they appeared overnight, or what I'd seen in the darkness. That evening, I decided to research Thaddeus Holloway. I found him in historical records. Born 1852, died 1905, buried in the Marlinton Cemetery. He'd been a surveyor for Pocahontas County for nearly 20 years, a respected professional. But I also found something else, a newspaper article from the Pocahontas Times, dated November 1904, describing a legal dispute. Thaddeus Holloway was being sued by Elijah Marsh over a property survey. Marsh claimed the survey was incorrect, that Holloway had deliberately misrepresented the boundaries to favor a different landowner. The dispute was bitter, accusatory, and according to the article, had escalated to threats. A follow-up article from March 1905 reported that Thaddeus Holloway had been found dead in the woods near a property he was surveying. Cause of death was listed as exposure and misadventure, but the article noted that he'd been missing for 3 days before his body was discovered. and that his surveying equipment was found arranged around him in a manner suggesting ritual or obsession. The property he'd been surveying when he died. The disputed marsh parcel. My land. I visited the Marlinton Cemetery, found Holloway's grave, a modest stone, weathered and tilted. Someone had been there recently. There were fresh stakes driven into the ground around the grave, marking a perfect square, each one topped with an orange ribbon. I pulled my phone and called the sheriff's department, reported trespassing and vandalism. A deputy met me at the cemetery, looked at the stakes and shrugged. Could be teenagers, could be historical society marking old graves, he said. Is anything damaged? Nothing was damaged. The deputy took a report, but clearly didn't consider it a priority. I left feeling like I was losing my mind, seeing connections that didn't exist, building conspiracy from coincidence. But that night, standing on my porch at midnight, I watched a figure walk the property line, carrying a lantern, driving stakes into the ground with methodical precision. Tall, thin, dressed in dark clothing that might have been period accurate for 1900. I could see him clearly in the lantern light, and he was transparent. Not invisible, not quite ghostly, but not solid either. Like I was seeing an image projected onto the air, a recording playing on a loop. I watched him for 20 minutes, and he never acknowledged my presence, never looked toward the cabin. He simply worked, measuring and marking, completing the survey he'd started over a century ago. By dawn, the stakes were gone again. But I found something new, a leather-bound surveying notebook lying in the grass near the root cellar. It was old, pages yellowed and brittle, filled with hand-drawn maps and calculations. The handwriting was elegant, precise, 19th century script. The final entry, dated November 1904. The boundary is correct. I have verified it 3 times. Marsh disputes because the line cuts through his spring. But the deed is clear. I will not change my survey to accommodate his temper. If he continues these threats, I will report him to the court. A surveyor's duty is to truth, not convenience. The handwriting ended mid-sentence on the next page. The ink smeared as if the writer had been interrupted. I took the notebook to the Historical Society in Marlinton, and they confirmed it was authentic. Thaddeus Holloway's field journal, missing since his death, assumed lost. They asked to keep it for archival purposes. I agreed, but I made copies of the relevant pages first, because I understood now what was happening. Holloway hadn't died of exposure. He died on that property. In the middle of the disputed survey, probably killed or left to die by someone who didn't want the truth recorded. And somehow, his work had remained unfinished. Not in the legal sense. The land had changed hands, been resurveyed, moved forward through time normally. But in some other sense, in whatever way consciousness persists beyond death, Thaddeus Holloway was still trying to complete that survey. Still marking boundaries, still driving stakes, still insisting on the accuracy of his measurements. I made a decision that might seem insane. On a cold November night, I went out to the property line with a mallet and 17 stakes. New stakes, professionally made, marked with surveyor's ribbons. And I drove them into the ground following the exact line Holloway had marked, the line described in his notebook, the disputed boundary from 1901. I worked for 2 hours, measuring carefully, placing each stake precisely. When I finished, I stood in the center of my property and spoke out loud, feeling ridiculous and desperate. Thaddeus Holloway, your survey was correct. The boundary is verified. Your work is complete. I didn't expect a response. I didn't get one. I went back to my cabin, exhausted and cold. But the next morning, the old stakes were gone. The ancient markers, the weathered wood, the corroded metal caps, all of it vanished. Only my new stakes remained, and even those seemed different somehow. Settled. Accepted. I never saw the figure again. No more sounds in the night, no more lantern light in the forest. The property line remained where I'd marked it, and after a few weeks, I stopped checking every morning to see if something had changed. The Historical Society contacted me months later. They'd been cataloging Halloway's notebook and found something interesting. A letter tucked between pages near the back, never sent, addressed to Elijah Marsh. It was an apology, dated the day before Halloway's disappearance. In it, he acknowledged that while his survey was technically correct, it failed to account for practical access to the spring, and he proposed a compromise boundary that would give Marsh water rights while maintaining legal accuracy. The compromise line he proposed? Almost exactly the boundary I'd marked with my stakes that November night. I don't know how I knew to place them there. I don't know how a ghost, if that's what it was, communicated the solution. But the dispute that had lasted over a century ended with 17 stakes driven into ground by a retired engineer who'd stumbled into a conflict that predated his birth. The official records still show my property boundaries according to the modern survey. I haven't filed paperwork to change them, and legally there's no reason to, but I maintain that line of stakes, replacing them when weather knocks them down, treating them like the border they represent. Because some boundaries aren't about legal descriptions or GPS coordinates. Some boundaries are about unfinished business, about truth that was never acknowledged, about work that persists beyond death because the living failed to honor it. If you buy land with history, especially land where disputes occurred, where surveying was contentious, pay attention to anything unusual. Sometimes the past isn't finished with a place. Sometimes the dead are still working, still trying to complete what they started, still insisting on being heard, and sometimes the only way to have peace is to help them finish what they began, even if it means acknowledging a truth that the living world moved on from decades ago. The call that came through at 4:47 a.m. was for an address that didn't exist. I was on duty at Station 12, the volunteer fire department serving Milton Ridge and the surrounding hollers in Braxton County, West Virginia. Population in our coverage area was maybe 800, spread across 45 square miles of mountain terrain. We ran maybe 24 calls a year, mostly vehicle accidents, occasional structure fires, medical assists until EMS could arrive from the county seat. The call came through on the old landline, not dispatch. That should have been the first warning. The phone rang with that mechanical bell sound phones don't make anymore, shrill in the quiet of early morning. I picked it up, expecting a misdial. A woman's voice, thin and frightened. "There's a fire at 1340 Kestrel Hollow Road. Please hurry. We're trapped upstairs." I grabbed a pen. "Ma'am, stay calm. How many people are in the house?" 3. Me, my husband, my daughter. The stairs are burning. We can't get down. We're on the way. Is there a window you can get to? Please hurry. Please. Static. Then the line went dead. I hit the alarm, waking the station. We were a volunteer crew. 6 of us on duty that night. 7 if you counted me. I'm James Burkhardt, 44 years old at the time, and I'd been the volunteer chief for Station 12 for 9 years. Full-time, I worked at the lumber mill in Sutton, but 3 nights a week I slept on the cot in the station office, taking calls, maintaining equipment, keeping the department running on a budget that barely covered fuel. The crew assembled in under 3 minutes. Good response time. I briefed them on the way to the engine. Structure fire. Occupants trapped, Kestrel Hollow Road. That's when Danny Reeves, our youngest volunteer, spoke up. "Chief, there's no 1340 Kestrel Hollow. That road only goes to about 900, then it's national forest." I had the county map book open, confirming what Danny said. Kestrel Hollow Road ran for 2.3 miles off Route 4, serving maybe a dozen houses, none of them numbered above 920. "Could be an old address," I said. "Or she meant a different road. We'll head toward Kestrel Hollow and look for smoke." We rolled out, engine 12 and our brush truck, 6 firefighters and me, driving into the pre-dawn darkness with lights flashing. Route 4 was empty, no other traffic, no sign of anything wrong. We turned onto Kestrel Hollow Road and drove slowly, scanning for fire glow, for smoke, for any indication of a structure. Nothing. Just dark houses, lights off, no emergency visible. We drove to the end of the maintained road where it became a gravel track leading into Forest Service land, and stopped. Radio County Dispatch, I told our radio operator, Tommy Vance. Confirm the address and see if they have any other calls in this area. Tommy tried. The radio produced nothing but static. He switched frequencies, tried again. More static. Our radios worked on a repeater system that covered most of the county, and we'd never had complete failure before. I tried my cell phone, no signal. Not unusual in the hollows, but we'd had at least one bar when we left the station. We'll canvass the houses, I decided. Wake people up, ask if anyone called 911. Someone knows something. We split into 2 teams, going door to door at the 5 houses closest to the end of the road. I took the first house, a small ranch with a pickup in the driveway. I knocked, waited, knocked harder. Lights came on, and a man in his 60s opened the door, looking understandably annoyed. "Sorry to wake you, sir. We got a call about a fire on this road. Have you seen or heard anything unusual tonight?" He blinked. "No fire that I know of. Everything's been quiet. You didn't call 911? "No, sir." I thanked him and moved to the next house. Same response. No one had called, no one had seen fire, no one knew anything about 1340 Kestrel Hollow Road. We regrouped at the engine, 6 firefighters and me standing in the middle of a gravel road in full turnout gear, with absolutely no emergency to respond to. "False alarm," Tommy suggested. "Or a prank." "That call came through the station landline," I said. "Not 911, not dispatch. How would someone even know that number?" No one had an answer. The landline at Station 12 was listed in the phone book under Fire Department Non-Emergency, but almost no one used it. Everything went through 911 dispatch. We were about to call it and return to the station when Danny pointed up the road toward the Forest Service boundary. "Chief, look!" In the distance, barely visible through the trees, there was light. Not firelight. Too steady, too warm. Like the glow of windows, multiple windows, coming from somewhere past the end of the maintained road. "There's nothing up there," Tommy said. "That's National Forest. No structures." But we could all see the light, and I'd gotten a call about a fire, about people trapped, about an address that shouldn't exist. I wasn't going back to the station without checking. "We walk in," I decided. "Brush truck stays here. Engine crew comes with me. We investigate." We geared up, air packs, tools, lights, and followed the gravel track as it deteriorated into a footpath, then into barely their trail. The light grew brighter as we approached, resolving into the clear shape of a house, 2 stories, lights on in the upper windows, and it was on fire. Not fully involved, but we could see smoke seeping from the lower windows, could see the orange flicker starting to show through the ground floor. "There's a goddamn house here," Danny breathed. We approached fast, assessing. The structure was old, early 20th century, wood frame construction, in remarkably good condition for something that should have been abandoned in the National Forest. There was a porch, a mailbox, and on the mailbox, barely legible in our flashlight beams, 1340. "Rescue mode," I ordered. "Danny, Tommy, front door, check for victims. Rest of you, pull a line in case we need to suppress." Danny and Tommy reached the front door, tried the handle. Locked. Tommy used the Halligan tool to force it, and smoke poured out. Thick, dark, the kind of smoke that means structural fire, contents burning. They entered with lights and thermal imaging. I stayed on the porch, coordinating, listening to their radio calls. "First floor clear, heavy smoke, fire in the kitchen area." Stairs are intact. We're going up. Second floor, checking rooms. There was a long pause, then Tommy's voice, tight with confusion. "Chief, you need to see this." I went in, climbed the stairs through smoke that was getting thicker, and found them in the master bedroom. The room was furnished, bed, dresser, pictures on the walls. But no fire damage here, just smoke seeping up from below. And on the bed, there were outlines. 3 of them, human-shaped, like shadows burned into the quilt. Adult-sized, child-sized, as if people had been lying there and simply stopped existing, leaving only their impression behind. "What the hell is this?" Tommy asked. I had no answer. I looked at the pictures on the wall. Family photos, a man, woman, and young girl, old-fashioned clothes, maybe 1950s or 60s. Happy faces, ordinary moments. "We need to get out," I said. "This smoke is getting toxic." We evacuated the structure, pulled back to a safe distance and watched as the fire grew, flames now visible through the first-floor windows. We had no water source up here. No hydrant, no pond, nothing. We couldn't stop it. All we could do was contain it if it threatened the forest. The house burned for 40 minutes, collapsing in on itself in stages, roof caving in, walls folding outward. By the time dawn light started filtering through the trees, there was nothing left but a smoldering foundation and chimney. And that's when things got stranger. As full daylight hit, we could see the lot clearly, and there was no foundation, no chimney, no debris. Just bare forest floor, covered in leaves, with trees growing in what should have been the footprint of the house. Mature trees, oak and maple, decades old. "Where did it go?" Danny asked. We searched the area. No evidence of fire, no ash, no charred wood. Nothing but undisturbed forest. Tommy checked his thermal imager. I'm still showing heat signatures. Right here in this spot, it's reading 20 degrees hotter than ambient. We stood there for an hour, trying to make sense of it. Eventually, we hiked back to the trucks, drove back to Station 12, and I filed a report that I knew sounded insane. Responded to structure fire at non-existent address. Found burning house in National Forest. House disappeared after burning. No evidence of structure found. I called the U.S. Forest Service, reported what we'd seen. They sent a ranger to the location. He found nothing. Confirmed that no structures existed in that area and none had existed in the 50 years of records they maintained. But I did my own research, digging through county historical records, old property files. And I found it. A house, constructed in 1927 at the end of Kestrel Hollow Road, purchased by a family named Denton. Arthur Denton, his wife Carolyn, and their daughter Ruth. The house burned in November 1962. Fire of unknown origin. Started in the middle of the night. Arthur, Carolyn, and Ruth all died. Their bodies were found in the master bedroom, overcome by smoke before they could escape. The volunteer fire department, Station 12, my station, responded but arrived too late to save them. The house was a total loss. In the incident report, filed by the fire chief at the time, there was a note. Family was trapped upstairs. Witnesses report seeing lights on and hearing calls for help, but flames prevented rescue. Victims likely called for help, but lines were down due to the fire. The phone call I received hadn't gone through dispatch. It had come directly to the station on the old landline, a number that had been the emergency contact number in 1962. I don't know how to explain what we experienced. We all saw it. 6 trained firefighters and me. We entered that house. We searched it. We saw the evidence. But it wasn't there. It had burned 58 years earlier. Except it hadn't finished burning. Or maybe it had been burning this whole time in whatever place things go when they're not quite gone, when trauma is so complete that it leaves an echo, a loop, a repetition that plays out in the space between what was and what is. The station landline still rings sometimes, late at night. I've answered it twice more in the years since. Both times it was the same woman's voice. "There's a fire at 1340 Kestrel Hollow Road. Please hurry. We're trapped upstairs." I don't respond anymore. I let it ring, because I know now that we can't get there in time. We never could. And the people making that call aren't waiting for rescue. They're beyond rescue, beyond time, trapped in a moment that repeats forever. The official fire department log shows that call as a false alarm. The incident is closed, but sometimes on November nights, when the temperature drops and the air gets that particular clarity that comes before dawn, I can smell smoke. And if I drive down Kestrel Hollow Road to where it ends, I can see a faint glow through the trees, distant and impossible. If you volunteer for emergency services in places with history, in areas where tragedy occurred, understand that some calls aren't for the present. Some calls come from the past, from moments so terrible they couldn't end, from people so desperate they're still crying for help. Decades after help became meaningless. You can't save them. All you can do is witness their suffering, and maybe, by bearing witness, acknowledge that they mattered, that someone heard them, even if it was too late. The town had 17 fewer people than it should have, and no one could tell me where they'd gone. I'm Claire Morrison, 31 years old, and in the summer of 2019 I was working for the U.S. Census Bureau as a field enumerator. It's temporary work, conducted every 10 years, and the job was simple. Visit households that hadn't returned their census forms, interview the residents, collect population data. I'd been assigned to rural areas of Nicholas County, West Virginia, places where mail service was spotty and internet access rare, where direct interviews were the only reliable way to get accurate counts. I'd been doing the work for 6 weeks, visiting isolated houses, talking to elderly residents, documenting households in places that barely appeared on maps. I was good at it, patient, thorough, respectful of people who were understandably suspicious of government representatives showing up unannounced. Hollowbrook was my last assignment in the county. It was a small, unincorporated community, really just a collection of houses in a valley between two ridges, accessible by a single road that branched off Route 39. The census records showed a population of 82 people in 27 households. Of those, 20 households hadn't returned their forms, which was my entire job there. Track them down, get the information, close out the assignment. I arrived on a Monday morning in late July, driving down the winding road into the valley. Hollowbrook was more intact than I'd expected. The houses were old but maintained. There was a community center, a small post office, even a church with a sign indicating services every Sunday. It looked like a functioning place, not the half-abandoned settlements I'd been working in. I started with the house closest to the main road, a neat white Cape Cod with a garden in front. I knocked, waited, knocked again. No answer. I left a door hanger with my contact information and moved to the next house. Same result. No answer. Curtains drawn, no cars in the driveway, no indication anyone was home. I worked through the morning, visiting 12 houses. Not one person answered. Not one car was present. The houses looked lived in. Gardens maintained, lawn furniture arranged on porches, mail in mailboxes, but empty. At the 13th house, I found something different. The door was slightly ajar, open maybe 2 inches, moving in the breeze. I knocked, announced myself loudly. "Hello, Census Bureau. Is anyone home?" No response. I pushed the door open wider and called inside. "This is Claire Morrison with the U.S. Census. I need to speak with the residents." Still nothing. I stood in the doorway, debating. Technically, I wasn't supposed to enter homes, but the open door and complete absence of people was concerning. This could be a welfare check situation, someone elderly or injured, unable to respond. I stepped inside. The house was immaculate. Clean kitchen, dishes drying in the rack, a newspaper on the table dated July 19th, 3 days ago. The living room was furnished and organized, family photos on the walls. I climbed the stairs, calling out the whole time, and found bedrooms that looked recently used. Beds made, clothes in closets, toiletries in the bathroom. But no people, no signs of violence or struggle or hasty departure. Just an empty house that felt paused, like the residents had stepped out for a moment and would return any second. I backed out, feeling like I'd invaded someone's privacy, and returned to my car. I tried calling the Census Bureau field office, but I had no cell signal in the valley. I'd need to drive back to higher ground to make a call. Before leaving, I decided to check a few more houses. The pattern repeated. Some locked and silent, a few with doors ajar, all of them showing signs of recent occupation but completely devoid of people. At the 17th house, I found the list. It was pinned to the front door, a handwritten sheet of paper, names written in careful script. 65 names, organized by household. At the bottom, a note. Census count for Hollowbrook, July 20th, 2019. Please forward to appropriate authorities. It was dated the day after the newspaper I'd seen 2 days ago. Someone had compiled their own census, listing every resident, and posted it publicly. But the official records showed 82 residents. This list had 65. 17 people were missing from the count. I photographed the list and took the original, folding it carefully into my bag. Then I drove back up the road to where I could get cell signal and called my supervisor. I need to report a situation in Hollowbrook. The town appears to be abandoned. I've checked over 20 houses and found no residents. I also found a handwritten census list that's missing 17 people from the official count. My supervisor, a woman named Patricia, who I'd been working with all summer, was silent for a moment. Missing 17 people. According to the list someone posted, yes. The official count from 2010 was 82. This list shows 65. Maybe those 17 moved away since the last census. Then why isn't anyone else there? The whole town is empty. She promised to contact the county sheriff and have someone check it out, but she also told me not to return to Hollowbrook until the situation was clarified. I agreed, relieved to have an excuse to stay away. I spent the rest of the day finishing assignments in other areas, but I couldn't stop thinking about that empty town, those open doors, that list of names with 17 people missing. The sheriff's department called me that evening. A deputy had visited Hollowbrook and found nothing unusual. He'd knocked on doors, spoken with several residents, and confirmed that people were home and accounted for. He suggested I'd been there at a time when everyone was away, perhaps a community event or church service. I was there for 4 hours, I told the deputy on the phone. I checked 27 houses. No one was home. Well, they're home now, ma'am. I spoke to at least 8 people myself. I felt crazy, but I also had photographs, timestamps, evidence of what I'd seen. Empty houses, open doors, that list. The next morning, I returned to Hollowbrook. The town was different. People were visible, working in gardens, sitting on porches, driving past in cars. It looked normal, occupied, alive. I felt a mix of relief and embarrassment. Maybe I'd arrived during some community event. Maybe everyone had been at a funeral. I parked and approached the first house, the White Cape Cod. This time, a woman answered, probably in her 70s, friendly. Good morning. I'm Claire Morrison with the U.S. Census Bureau. I stopped by yesterday, but no one was home. The woman smiled. Oh, we were probably at the church picnic. Whole town goes. Sorry you missed us. I conducted the interview, collected the household information, 2 residents, herself and her husband, and thanked her. As I was leaving, I asked casually, how many people live in Hollowbrook these days? "Oh, I'd say about 60 or so," she said. "Used to be more, but folks have moved away over the years." 60. The last census showed 82. She looked puzzled. "I don't think we've had that many in a long time, dear." I moved to the next house. Same experience. Friendly resident, cooperative interview, no problems. But when I asked about population, they estimated 60 to 65 people. Not 82. By the end of the day, I'd completed interviews at all 27 households. Every single resident confirmed they'd been at a church picnic the day before, which explained why no one had been home. Total population, based on my actual count, 65 people, 17 fewer than the 2010 census. I reported the discrepancy to my supervisor, who suggested the 2010 census had been inaccurate or that people had moved away without updating records. It happened. Census data wasn't perfect, but I couldn't let it go. That night, in my motel room in Somersville, I went through the 2010 census records for Hollowbrook, comparing names to the list I'd found and the interviews I'd conducted. 17 names from the 2010 census were missing. They weren't on the handwritten list. They hadn't been mentioned by any current residents. And when I asked specifically about them, "Do you know the Whitfield family?" Or, "Is there a resident named Thomas Gentry?" people looked confused. "Never heard of them," was the consistent response. I started searching online, looking for those 17 names combined with Hollowbrook or Nicholas County. Nothing. No social media. No obituaries. No records. It was as if they'd never existed. Except they had. The 2010 census was official federal record. Those people had been counted, their information recorded, their existence documented. I made one more trip to Hollowbrook, this time to the post office. The postmaster was a man in his 50s, friendly, who'd lived there his whole life. "I'm trying to verify some information," I said. "I have names from an old census, and I'm wondering if you remember these residents." I read him the list of 17 names. He listened, nodding occasionally, then shook his head. "Can't say I recall any of those people," he said, "and I know everyone in this valley. Born and raised here. None of them. The 2010 census lists them as residents." He shrugged. "Censuses make mistakes sometimes. Maybe they were counted wrong, so listed addresses that didn't match." "What about the old cemetery?" I asked. "Would any of them be buried there?" He gave me directions to a small cemetery on the hillside above the church. I hiked up and found about 40 graves, the most recent from 2015. I checked every stone. None of the 17 missing names were there. I left Hollowbrook that afternoon and never returned. I filed my census report with a population count of 65, noted the discrepancy with the 2010 count, and moved on to my next assignment. But months later, after the census was complete and I'd returned to my regular job, I received an email from Patricia, my census supervisor. She'd been going through historical data and found something strange. The 2000 census for Hollowbrook had counted 82 people. The 1990 census had counted 82 people. The 1980 census had counted 82 people. Every census since 1940 had recorded exactly 82 residents in Hollowbrook until 2019, when it dropped to 65. "It's statistically impossible," Patricia wrote. "Population fluctuates. People are born, die, move. No place maintains exactly the same count for 7 decades, but according to official records, Hollowbrook did." She dug deeper and found that the specific number, 82, appeared in records going back even further to early 20th century tax documents and county registries, as if Hollowbrook was required to maintain that exact population. Until 2019, until 17 people somehow stopped existing. I've thought about those 17 names often. I've wondered if they were real people who left and were somehow erased from memory, or if they were never real at all. placeholder names, fictional residents maintained in census records for reasons I can't understand. But I remember that first day, when the town was empty, when I walked through those silent houses and felt like I'd stumbled into a place that was waiting, that was incomplete. And I remember the list on the door, handwritten and urgent, as if someone was trying to document the truth before something changed. The 2020 census showed Hollowbrook with a population of 65. The 17 names never reappeared. And when I looked at the detailed records, I found something that made my skin crawl. The households were exactly the same, the families identical, even the ages matched. 10 years had passed, but no one in Hollowbrook had aged. No children had been born, no one had died. As if the town had been paused in 2019, locked into that count of 65, and time had simply stopped moving there. I don't work for the census anymore. But sometimes I think about those 17 people, whoever they were, and where they went. And I wonder if places like Hollowbrook exist in the way we understand existence, or if there's something else. Spaces that follow different rules, that maintain themselves through repetition, that only appear real until you look too closely. If you ever work a job that requires you to count things, to document reality, pay attention to numbers that don't change when they should. Because sometimes consistency isn't reliable. Sometimes it's evidence that something is maintaining an illusion, keeping a place locked in a specific state for reasons we can't see. And when that illusion breaks, when the count suddenly changes, it means something was removed or revealed, and you might be the only one who noticed it was ever there. The music started exactly 4 weeks after she died, playing from a speaker system we'd thrown away 3 years earlier. My wife, Laura, had been a musician, a violinist with the Charleston Symphony Orchestra for 18 years. She died in March 2021 from complications of pneumonia, sudden and devastating, and I'd buried her in the cemetery in Fayetteville, where 3 generations of her family rested. I was alone in the house we'd shared for 12 years, trying to figure out how to continue existing without her. I'm Nathan Cross, 53 years old, and I'm a music professor at West Virginia University. I met Laura when we were both students, fell in love over late-night practice sessions, built a life around music and teaching, and the quiet contentment of 2 people who understood each other completely. Her death broke me in ways I'm still trying to articulate. I'd been going through her things slowly, unable to rush the process. Her music room had remained untouched. I couldn't bring myself to pack up her instruments, her sheet music, the recording equipment she'd used to practice and compose. It was a shrine, and I visited it like a mourner visits a grave. The music started on a Tuesday night in late April, around 10 p.m. I was in the living room, trying to read, when I heard it. Violin music, clear and beautiful, coming from the music room upstairs. Laura's music room. I climbed the stairs, heart pounding, and pushed open the door. The room was empty, but music was playing, unmistakably, from the corner where her desk and computer had been. Except the computer wasn't there anymore. I'd packed it away. The speakers weren't there either. We'd replaced that whole system years ago. But the music continued, that specific rich resonance of good speakers, playing a piece I recognized, Arvo Pärt's Spiegel im Spiegel, one of Laura's favorites. She'd performed it 100 times, recorded it dozens of times for practice. The sound was coming from empty air. I stood there, listening, tears streaming down my face, until the piece ended. Then silence. I searched the room, looking for any electronics that might be producing sound. Nothing. Just Laura's violin in its case, her sheet music, her empty chair. I told myself it was grief, auditory hallucination, my brain trying to cope with loss by recreating her presence. I'd read about it. Widows hearing their husband's voice, parents hearing their children, the mind filling absence with echo. The next night, it happened again. Same time, same piece, same phantom speakers. I recorded it on my phone, audio levels showing clear music being captured, proving I wasn't hallucinating. On the third night, I was waiting. At 10:02 p.m. the music started, but this time it wasn't Spiegel im Spiegel. It was something I didn't recognize, a composition I'd never heard before. Violin, solo, playing in Laura's style. Her phrasing, her dynamics, her particular way of handling long notes, but unfamiliar. I grabbed my phone and recorded the entire piece, nearly 8 minutes of original music, beautiful and haunting, played by invisible instruments in an empty room. When it ended, I sat in the darkness and spoke aloud. "Laura, if that's you, I need to understand what's happening." No response. Just the house settling. The silence that had become my constant companion. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I transcribed the music from the recording, writing it out in notation by hand, the way Laura had taught me. It was complex, sophisticated, absolutely her compositional voice. But it wasn't anything I'd ever seen in her files, her scores, her documented work. She'd been composing something new. And now, somehow, I was hearing it. I reached out to Margaret Chen, a colleague from the music department who specialized in electronic music and recording technology. I sent her the audio files, asked if she could identify any technical explanation for what I was experiencing. Margaret called me 2 days later. "Nathan, this is remarkable. The music is definitely playing. The recordings are clean, no artifacts or interference. But there's something strange about the audio signature. It's too pure. Modern digital audio has compression, processing, even the best systems introduce some noise. This sounds like a direct feed, like the music is being generated exactly where it's being recorded, with no medium in between. What does that mean? I don't know. Could you set up multiple recording devices at different positions in the room? I want to see if the audio source has a physical location." I did what she suggested. The next night, I positioned 4 phones around the music room, all set to record simultaneously. At 10:02 p.m. the music began. A different piece, again unfamiliar, again unmistakably Laura's work. After it ended, Margaret analyzed the recordings. Her conclusion was impossible. The music was emanating from a specific point in space, approximately where Laura's desk had been, but the audio reached all 4 recording devices with identical clarity, no inverse square fall-off, no directional characteristics, as if the sound was being produced everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. "It's not following physics," Margaret said quietly. "Sound doesn't behave this way." The music continued every night for a week, each time a different movement or piece, building into what was clearly a larger work. I transcribed everything, assembling a portfolio of compositions I'd never seen while Laura was alive. On the 8th night, the music stopped. I waited in the room, recording equipment ready, but nothing played. Just silence. Instead, at 10:02 p.m., I heard her voice. Not music, not performance. Her speaking voice, clear as if she were standing beside me. "Nathan, I need you to finish it." I almost dropped my phone. "Laura, I can't hold this much longer. The piece isn't complete. Movement 4, I couldn't finish it before You need to write it. You know how I work. Finish it for me." "I don't understand. How are you doing this?" "I don't know. I've been trying to reach you. It took so long to figure out how. Please, Nathan, the music matters. It needs to exist. Promise me you'll finish it." I promise, Laura, I'll do it. Thank you. I love you. I always will." The presence, the feeling that someone else was in the room, faded. I felt it go like a drop in temperature, like pressure releasing. I sat there until dawn, holding my phone with that recording, playing it back over and over, hearing her voice, trying to memorize it, trying to keep her with me for a few more hours. In the morning, I went through all the compositions I'd transcribed. There were 3 complete movements, roughly 40 minutes of music total, and then a fragment, a musical idea that ended mid-phrase in what should have been the 4th movement. I'm a professor. I teach music theory and composition. But I'm not a composer, not in Laura's league. She had a gift, an ability to create beauty that I could only analyze and teach, but I'd promised her. And I had her compositional voice transcribed, dozens of examples of her style, her patterns, her choices. I could finish what she'd started. I spent 3 months on it. I worked every night, sitting at her desk, using her sheet music paper, following the trajectory of her musical ideas. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, trying to channel someone else's creativity, trying to extend a conversation that had been interrupted by death. In late July, I completed the 4th movement. I'd written 97 measures of music that I hoped desperately honored what Laura had begun. I hired 4 musicians, violin, viola, cello, piano, and rented a recording studio. We spent 2 days recording the complete work, all 4 movements, exactly as transcribed and composed. The musicians were extraordinary, and as the final notes resolved, I felt something I hadn't felt since Laura died. Peace. I titled the work Epilogue, and I listed the composer as Laura Cross, with a note. 4th movement completed by Nathan Cross from the composer's sketches. We released it through a small new music label. It didn't chart, didn't become famous, but it found its audience. Musicians discovered it, performed it, recognized its beauty. It became part of Laura's legacy. 3 weeks after the recording was released, I was in the music room late at night when I heard her voice one last time. Not through speakers, not from empty air, but inside my head, gentle and close. "Thank you. It's beautiful. You understood." "I miss you," I said aloud. "I know, but this helps. The music exists now. That matters. Will I hear from you again?" There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was fading, distant. "I don't think so. This was what I needed to finish. You gave that to me. Now I can let go." "I don't want you to let go. You have to live, Nathan. You have to keep making music. Promise me." "I promise. I love you. Always." Then silence. Real silence. The kind that doesn't feel like waiting, but like completion. I never heard the music again. The room remained just a room, empty of presence, empty of impossible sound. I eventually packed up Laura's instruments, donated them to the university's music program, where students could use them. I kept her violin for myself, mounted on the wall, a memorial and a reminder. Epilogue has been performed 17 times now, in small venues and university concerts. Each time I attend, I listen for her and the music, for some trace of what happened those weeks after her death. I don't hear anything supernatural, just beautiful music, exactly as she would have wanted it. The official explanation, the one I give when people ask how we discovered this lost composition, is that I found sketches in her papers after her death and decided to complete them as a tribute. That's close enough to the truth for public consumption, but the real truth is stranger and more precious. For a brief time, the boundary between life and death was thin enough for her to reach through, to speak, to share what she'd been unable to finish. She didn't come back to haunt or frighten. She came back to create, to leave something beautiful in the world, to complete a thought that death had interrupted. I'm a rational man. I understand music as physics, vibrations, frequencies, resonance. I don't believe in ghosts in the traditional sense, but I know what I experienced. I know I heard her music playing from speakers that didn't exist. I know I heard her voice giving me instructions, asking me to finish her work. and I know that love doesn't end when the body fails. Sometimes it finds ways to persist, to communicate, to leave evidence of its existence in the world. For Laura, that evidence was music. And for a few weeks, she defied everything I understand about reality to make sure that music survived. If you lose someone who created beauty, who left work unfinished, listen carefully. Not with your ears, but with the space in your heart where they used to live. Because sometimes the dead aren't silent. Sometimes they're still working, still creating, still trying to leave something meaningful behind. And if you're fortunate, if you're paying attention, they'll find a way to share it with you one last time.